This is Clark.
And this is a comparison between the Hinderer Project X and the good old XM-18. I've got full reviews on both of these knives, and as anybody who's seen them will note, this is, I think, still the highest rated knife that I have reviewed. The Project X is a supremely impressive large knife, and the base XM-18 is a knife that I very much liked a lot of pieces of, but also very much disliked some other pieces of. The XM-18 has been Hinderer's signature knife for a very long time. It is the knife that got most people familiar with the brand, and I'm sure that most people that are looking at the at the Project X will have some experience with the XM-18. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how these knives are similar, how they are different, and in particular, why I like the XM-18, or why I like the Project X so much more than the standard full-size XM-18. So let's just get into it, and we'll start with the things that are similar. First off, you can see in overall length and size, these knives are generally pretty similar. You've got just about the same blade length. The Project X is a little bit longer. Similarly, just about the same handle length. The handle is a little bit longer on the Project X than the XM-18, but honestly, those differences are not particularly material. Thickness, also the same. Standard Hinderer 165 thousandths blade stock for both the standard XM-18 and the Project X. Standard Hinderer scale thickness for both the show side and the lock side. And then if you put them sort of butt to butt, you can see they are either exactly the same thickness or so close in thickness that I certainly can't see a difference. I highly expect that they are exactly the same thickness. They're also pretty similar in weight. The XM-18, depending on what configuration, is usually somewhere in the 5-ounce range. The Project X is in the 6-ounce range, and that is because even though they're about the same length, it is a little bit longer. The blade is a little bit taller. This handle is a little bit taller. There's just a little bit more to the Project X than the XM-18. But generally, these are both relatively heavy knives by the standard of 2024, especially for, 3.5 inches. These are well above that ounce and inch mark that you're seeing more and more knives approach these days. They're also very similar in price. The standard XM-18 is either $425 or $450, depending on what retailer you're purchasing it from. I think directly from the ranch, they're usually $425 these days in a standard stonewash configuration with either a basic anodization job or no anodization on the lock side. The Project X is $75 more expensive, so it is $500 full retail. But there are a couple very specific differences that can explain that price delta that leads me to believe that a XM-18 with the same features would be the exact same price. First, the Project X has this integrated backspacer piece, which, you can pull this tool out, and it is your pivot tool and your hardware tool. Pulled that over from the full track. It is a very cool little feature, and there obviously is some cost associated with producing this little doohickey. They've made separate backspacers for the Jurassic, that have some of those features, and they're not exactly cheap. So that's some of it. And then the second piece is you have a fully textured lock side on the Project X, which you can only get in very rare versions of the XM-18. The vast majority of XM-18s out there have a smooth lock side, just like you see here. You can get a Project X and an XM-18. I'll keep them on this side for a little bit. You can get both these knives in all of the same finishes. They both come in this smooth stonewash. It's the same stonewash between the two knives. You can get them both in working finish, which is Hinderer's sort of bead blasted stonewash rougher finish. You can get them both in all sorts of different anodizations in the stonewash or the working finish. They've made battlefield pickup versions of both of them if you want to spend an enormous amount of money on an XM-18. The The Project X is a newer knife, so right now it's only available in this clip point version. The XM-18, of course, is available in like 6 or 7 different blade shapes by this point. This one happening to be the recurve. And then, last but not least, in terms of, now that we're switching over to differences a little bit, so I guess I've started the differences, I'm through the similarities. So, clip position, Hinderer is a 2-position clip. I prefer to have my Hinderers carry, what is this? I always forget, tip down. I think the ergonomics are much better when you have the clip right here, but you can switch it either way. The XM-18 is exclusively tip up. The Project X is exclusively tip up. The Project X is quite obviously only a flipper. There is no thumb stud here. The only option that you've got is this big old flipper tab right here. It works fantastically well, but it is the only option you've got. The XM-18 is, of course, in most configurations, both a flipper and a thumb stud opener, because these blade stops work just fine as thumb studs as well. Oh, I guess one other thing that I should have said on the similarities, the fit and finish, the general level of spit and polish that Hinderer brings these two knives is identical. There's no difference in how tight the tolerances are, how good the action is. They're both on the tri-way system. You know, they're both Hinderers, and Hinderers are produced at an extremely high level of production in 2024. So, you know, there's differences in sort of config. You know, you've got your standoffs here instead of that backspacer, all that sort of stuff. There's differences in, you know, more jimping, shape. We'll go through all of those. But the actual level of sort of tightness and precision and machining quality and all that, the fit and finish, all that, identical between the two knives. So back to the differences. Again, method of deployment, slightly different between the two of them. Ergonomics. Ergonomics are dramatically different between the two of them. So the XM-18, I'll talk about this one here. One of the most sort of storied and signature designs in all of the knife industry. And it's not actually that thick of a knife, but it has this very strong downward curve, which basically, as you put this knife into your palm, and this big flat rests against your palm, this curve down here, your pinkies and the base of your hand sort of wrap around it. And even though it's not that tall of a knife, this gives you an extremely secure grip. This knife does not want to move up, down, side to side anywhere. This jimping here gives you nice little indexing for your thumb. This is a very, very secure grip. It's also not uncomfortable. Very nice chamfers all the way around here. And again, these big flats do prevent the knife from even thinking about rotating in your hand. I find with this clip here, the ergonomics are even better against these first couple fingers. Choked up, ergonomics are just as good when you want to get close up to the cut. You really can get your thumb right up on this blade, whatever the blade shape. You've usually got this position right here, and your 3 fingers go nicely in here. You're still getting that curve, bringing it down towards your pinky and sort of curving away from your palm a little bit. Lets your palm wrap around a little bit. It's just a very, very secure, very powerful grip for the XM-18. There is, cut myself. There is quite a bit of jimping throughout on the knife. It is kind of notorious for that jimping there, jimping there, jimping there. It's just, I actually cut myself a little decently on the butt, on the base of that blade there. So anyway, lots of jimping. Honestly, the jimping is not all that harsh. It doesn't bother me all that much, all this jimping. I find that it's easy to ignore if you do want to ignore it. So I've never had a big issue with it, but it is part of the ergonomics. The fact is, the ergonomics of this XM-18 here are very famous for a reason. It's a relatively slim and relatively skinny knife, at least in this dimension. You know, it folds up to not that big of a profile for how big a knife it is. But it is that curve and all of these sort of curves in that handle design that give it such exceptionally robust and secure ergonomics. Compare that to the Project X here, and this is basically a big block. This handle here is a big rectangle. There is still a little bit of that downward curve, but honestly, this is much more of a straight line. In fact, I'll bring out the XM-18 to compare. Your Project X here, much straighter across the top, much straighter across the bottom, much fatter throughout the entire knife. Still ergonomically very secure, very good. This does not want to roll in the hand. You know, my first finger is secure here, my back three are secure here, and it fills the hand. The difference is it does it primarily by just being a big old brick with nice chamfers and with some flat sides here. That is really how the Project X ends up feeling very secure in the hand. Now, as a result, the ergonomics are very, very good for heavy duty tests, but the ergonomics are not as versatile as the XM-18. First off, there is no choke up position. This is a sharpening choil, not a finger choil. No ability to choke up on the knife. And frankly, even if you could, this front finger index is a little too large. My middle finger is kind of floating here. This grip wouldn't be quite so great on the Project X, even if it was there. But also, it's just, you can't climb up and down the knife on the Project X as easily as you can in the XM-18. And even though it is a much larger handle, and so it is a much larger knife despite being the same length, the ergonomics are slightly less secure, slightly less sort of confidence-inspiring than the XM-18. That's not to say that they're bad. They're not. They're fantastic. They're still some of the best large hard knife ergonomics that I have handled. But the XM-18 is in a class of its own ergonomically. It remains one of the absolute best ergonomic designs in the entire knife industry. And so the simpler design, the straighter design of the XM or of the Project X, it looks cool, and it works very well on those larger tasks. But particularly when you start to get into those smaller tasks, it does feel like a lot of knife in a way that the XM-18, from an ergonomic perspective, doesn't necessarily. So ergonomics absolutely better on the XM-18 than the Project X, though we're really comparing two exceptional models in that regard. Carry profile is also markedly better on the full-size XM-18 than the Project X. Now, the Project X, as I mentioned in my review, the carry profile isn't that bad because of how neatly this blade folds up into the handle. You know, really you're talking about, especially because, you know, if you look at the line between sort of these ends of the handle, this blade is not sticking out beyond those, so it really doesn't feel like you're carrying as big a knife as it is when you're carrying this Project X. But the XM-18, you can just see putting them next to each other here. It is both lighter and it is just a significantly smaller object in the pocket than the XM-18. Put them over on this side, and you know, in some ways you can see it a little bit more clearly even. I also, frankly, the fact that you have tip up or tip down carry, that is a plus for me. Again, I prefer to carry my Hinderers tip down. I do kind of wish you had that option for the Project X, but I don't think it would necessarily give the same ergonomic benefits it gives the XM-18. This is especially true because of the way that the XM-18 tapers toward the butt. So sort of the ends of the knife can really disproportionately affect how big it feels in the pocket, where a knife that has either a big head or a big butt, and especially that is big across its whole length like this, it's going to feel like having a big rectangle in your pocket, and sometimes it'll be a little harder to slide things past it, to move around it. You know, an extreme version of this is that's part of the reason that your AD20 feels so big in the pocket, because these ends are just huge. The Project X is not nearly that bad, but when you consider how nicely the XM-18 tapers at its ends, the XM-18 is easier to ignore in the pocket than a knife of its size might necessarily be. It still feels big, it still feels heavy, you still feel it swinging around, but it is about the same blade size as your Project X, and it is noticeably smaller. So both of those points, ergonomics and carry profile, absolutely go to the XM-18. Now, I can't, and then one last, and then we'll get to the big one. Aftermarket, by a mile goes the XM-18. I don't think there's a knife on the market, even with the rich aftermarkets we've got for the Paramilitary 2 and the Bug Out. I don't think there's a knife on the market that has the same ridiculous level of aftermarket support that the XM-18 has. It helps that most of the aftermarket parts, if you bought them for, an XM-18 Gen 2, I'm pretty sure they still fit the current XM-18s. I mean, people have been making aftermarket parts for Hinderers for years, probably more than a decade by this point. And so you can get all sorts of stuff straight from the ranch. It's very expensive, but you can get it here. This has bronze anodized hardware on there. That's cool. It is cool that you can, quote unquote, make it your own, as Hinderer says, and turn your XM-18 into whatever sort of configuration you want, as long as you've got the blade design and the lock side anodization that you're looking for. That's cool. The Project X does not have that aftermarket yet. I don't know if you can get aftermarket hardware. I'm not aware of it yet. I've seen, I think, 1 or 2 aftermarket scales, but it's just not there yet. It is also, though, a newer knife, and there haven't been that many of them made. I'm sure if Hinderer were to ramp up production on the Project X, we would start seeing those relatively quickly. So, small edge to the XM-18 there. But the really big one, so, basically, to summarize so far, with everything that I've talked about, in all of the differences between these two knives, I prefer the XM-18 over the Project X. I prefer the ergonomics, I prefer the carry profile, and frankly, I also prefer the looks. I think the XM-18 is a very cool looking knife. That tank-like aesthetic that's associated with all the jimping, and just the fact that it is such a signature knife in American knife making, that does give it a real cool factor for me. So all those things I love about the XM-18. But, as you saw in my XM-18 review, the big problem that I've always had with every full thickness XM-18 I've had is this blade. And this is the recurve blade, but what I'm about to say is true for every single XM-18 full thickness blade that I have ever had. I have owned the Wharncliffe, I have owned the Bowie, I have owned the Slicer. Let's see, I have owned a sheep's foot. Actually, my sheep's foot might have been a skinny. I've owned a Harpoon Spanto, which was the worst cutting knife that I have ever owned of any sort by anybody ever. I've owned a Skinner. Every single Hinderer XM-18 blade shape that I have ever had has cut terribly. Absolutely terribly. These things, with so little space to drop, with a relatively short blade and not that much space to drop from 165,000 stock down to the edge, they're just simply fat behind the edge. And they are knives that when they come from the factory with a Hinderer factory edge, I find their cutting performance to be wholly unacceptable. I find that they literally struggle to cut cardboard. And for any more delicate task than that, don't even bother trying. This one was an example. I have tried now multiple times, and I did the same thing with my Eclipse. Where is it? I've got an Eclipse Bowie that seems to have run away. But I did the same thing with my Eclipse Bowie. I laid the edge back very significantly. Oh wait, no, oh there it is right in front of me. Yeah, my Eclipse Bowie right here. I did the same thing with the Eclipse Bowie, which has the same blade thickness as I did with my XM-18 full thickness. Laid the edge back to 17 degrees, and then it kind of sort of cut decently well. If I put this one in here, because honestly, everything I'm saying about the blade applies completely equally to the Eclipse and the XM-18. These knives just don't cut all that well. They really just, I don't think their cutting performance is acceptable for an EDC knife in 2024. The Project X, on the other hand, and you can see, if you look at these two knives, look at how much more space this grind has to drop from the start of the grind down to the edge. It's literally about twice as much height from where the grind starts to where the grind terminates. on the Project X compared to the XM-18. And by the way, the buoy is pretty much exactly the same. You will see some slight differences in how high this grind starts on the XM-18, depending on which blades you get, but frankly, they're all just about the same. We're talking relatively small differences, even if you get something like the slicer grind. And then don't even talk to me about the Tonto and Spanto grinds. Those things are bricks. But you got literally double the space for this grind to go from 165 thousandths down to the cutting edge, and it makes an astonishing difference. This knife cuts better than any 165 thousandth thick knife that I have ever owned. Not just better than any Hinderer. This thing, out of the box, without me doing anything to the edge, it slices cardboard effortlessly, beautifully. It slices cardstock and things like that cleanly. Light paper, it'll cut right through it. It doesn't tear. And then you push it into harder use tasks and it slices and bites. This edge will cut like you hope a knife would. It's not even just that this knife doesn't have bad edge geometry, which would have been impressive and worth talking about by itself, given the history of Hinderer knives. But this Project X has legitimately excellent edge geometry and legitimately excellent cutting geometry, to the point that it is one of the better slicing and better performing knives that I have had. And I am truly not aware of a production scale knife that has blade stock this thick that has had better cutting performance. The only one that I can think of that might compete is I do need to try a Strider SNG again, because Strider's dagger grind is similarly phenomenal. But anyway, this is certainly up there near the tippy top of cutting performance with a thick blade stock. Which brings us to the problem with this comparison and the problem with these two knives. You saw in my review of the Project X, I really, really like the Project X. This is a really, really good knife. The fit and finish is fantastic. The blade, I can't sing the praise of it enough. The handle ergonomics are very good for those big, heavy-duty tasks. It's not nearly as nimble or versatile as the XM-18, but they are super, super secure, and especially if you want to use this as a big, heavy, hard-use knife, they're great for that. The problem is, in every single one of those regards except for the blade performance, I like the XM-18 even better. Everything that is great about the Project X is also great about the XM-18, but the ergonomics, the carry profile, and honestly just parts of the cool factor are even better with the XM-18 than the Project X. The problem is that blade performance detail, that cutting performance difference, is so extreme, and it goes from so bad in the XM-18 to so good in the Project X, that honestly, I find the Project X overall to be a more recommendable knife. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you two, maybe three things. So first, it does suggest that there is still, even in 2024, and the reason I'm saying that is Hinderer's cutting performance felt less radically bad probably some years ago, back when Hinderers were really hot, because knives simply were not as slicey as they are today. Grinds tended to not be as good as they are today. And so its slicing performance was still just as bad, probably even slightly worse than it is now, but it didn't stand out quite as much. Whereas now this feels very behind the curve. But there is probably, I would say almost certainly, a very good knife, even by 2024 cutting performance standards, in the XM-18. I love so much about the XM-18, but this is a knife that, if there's any knife out there that could benefit from a third-party regrind from BGM Knives or somebody like that, it is probably the XM-18. The problem with that is it's still a relatively short blade. You're not going to have that much space to drop, and so you're going to have to do one of two things. you're going to have to bring this up to be basically a full flat grind or something close to it, which is going to butcher the aesthetics of the blade. It's also going to butcher some of that strength that you have from that big old saber grind. So it feels a little ill-suited. And if you don't do that, you're just trying to make this flat grind more aggressive or make it hollow, which could bring it down to a keener edge. I'll talk about this hollow grind this hollow grind Eclipse later in comparison to the normal Eclipse, and making this grind a hollow grind absolutely does help. And it helps actually a pretty significant degree. But it just turned it from a bad cutter to a decent cutter. So I'm of two minds about that, about whether a regrind really helps, because you are taking away a lot of what makes the XM-18 the XM-18 when you do that. I guess it's just what is fundamentally frustrating is it really does show how much this brilliant XM-18 design is held back by its blade geometry. Because if you literally could take this XM-18 blade, this Project X blade or something like it, where you brought the grind up this high, you made maybe the whole knife or at least the whole blade a little bit taller. I don't know quite how you could do that without making the handle a ton fatter, but there might be a way to do it with, all the angles and geometry and things like that. If you made that blade a little bit taller, you gave it either a shallow hollow grind like on the newer hollow grind ones, or you even just gave it a more aggressive flat grind. Basically, if you got the blade performance of the Project X, put it on the XM-18, that would be a world beater of a knife. That would be an extraordinary knife. Now, I will tell you, your skinny XM-18 comes damn close. But that's not what we're talking about today. That's a review for another day. But what I just said, that's why this is one of my favorite knives. It really all just shows how much that one area needs to be improved in the XM-18, but I think it can be improved. As for the Project X, as much as I love the Project X and gave it such a glowing review, this comparison also shows where, even though I even called it peak Hinderer, where it does lack a bit of the sublime inspiration, lack a bit of the things that made the XM-18 truly great, or even, or that even made the Eclipse a really good knife. The Eclipse is a more modern design, and like most modern Hinderer designs, it doesn't have as much jimping. It's a little more straight, a little less curved, things like that. But the Eclipse, once you put the clip on the right way, still is ergonomically better and better in the pocket than the Project X. It's got the same shitty blade geometry as the XM-18, but it is better ergonomically in the pocket, and in the pocket it's closer to the XM-18 in both those regards. So this comparison does show that there are aspects of the Project X that still could be improved. This isn't an ergonomically perfect handle. It's still extremely good by general knife industry standards, but it's far from the best handle that Hinderer has made. In fact, it might be, I really don't like the half track, but for Hinderer's full-size knives, if you look at the XM-18, the Eclipse, the Jurassic, and now the full track, I'll put the the Project X. The Project X is probably my least favorite from a pure ergonomic perspective. Those are four ergonomically exceptional knives, but it's still my least favorite of the bunch. So this comparison really does show the extent to which the Project X is a big, chunky, kind of exclusively hard-use knife in a way that the XM-18 is not. That bigness does hold it back. So I think my conclusion is that as of today, the Project X is still, for me, by far the more recommendable knife between these two. But that really is entirely because of that cutting performance. These two knives are both very, very good in every other regard, but in every regard where they differ, other than that blade performance, I prefer the XM-18. Happens to also be a little cheaper, happens to have that exceptional aftermarket. So, all of this to say, the Project X, as good a review as I gave it, could still get better, and the XM-18, if you were to create a slicey version of the XM-18. I mean, I don't know how you would necessarily do that, but if somebody were to create, you know, a very slicey version of the XM-18 that kept the ergonomics, kept the, you know, kept all the lines, things like that, kept the visual aspects of it, that hard use feel, maybe made it even a little bit better to carry, that could be a really, really exceptional knife. But, I mean, I don't know if somebody has thought of a way to do that or not. I'm obviously joking there. The skinny version is a really, really good knife. But I would love to see the full thickness XM-18 learn from the Project X to become a better knife still. And frankly, I think with what Rick is doing with the hollow ground knives, it's absolutely a step in the right direction. This and the hollow ground knives and the Project X are both indications that Rick Hinderer is starting to care about slicing performance in a way that his brand historically has not. You know, Hinderer's attitude has very much been, for much of the past, we're a hard use knife, we're meant to be a knife you beat the snot out of, we're not for slicing grapes, so if you want, you know, slicing performance, find another knife. That was okay when everybody was building, you know, big hard use knives. It feels just sort of retrograde and dated in 2024 and makes the knives much harder to recommend. Like, this is an unacceptably poor performer in 2024. But with the taller grind of the Project X shows that Hinderer can make a slicing knife. The performance increase you get from this light hollow on the Eclipse, full review coming up, shows that Hinderer can make a slicier knife without even changing all that much. So I think really my conclusion is that good things are coming right now from Hinderer and could be coming from Hinderer. They could be addressing some of the major problems that I had with this XM-18 in that review. And the Project X may in fact sort of be a sign of good things to come. As of right now, as of today, to say it one more time, I do think the Project X is the better knife, but that is really just because that delta in slicing performance is so extreme between these two knives. Everything else but the XM-18 I like better. Hopefully you found that rambly summary helpful. If you've got any thoughts on these two knives, which do you prefer? Why do you prefer it? Maybe you've had better experiences with the cutting performance of the XM-18 than I have. Maybe your Project X didn't cut as well as mine did. There's all sorts of reasons that you might have a different opinion than I do. Maybe you found the ergonomics even better on the Project X. I don't, but you certainly could. I do think the Project X is absolutely worth trying for any Hinderer fan, and I think even people that have discarded Hinderer for some of the same reasons that I have, because they're huge. I mean, this is still huge, but because of that cutting performance, give the Project X a look. So yeah, hope that was helpful. Hope you found that to be a good use of your time. Hope it was informative. If you know the XM-18 and you don't know the Project X, hopefully it gave you a better understanding of what to expect, how they might differ, what parts of the XM-18 that you like translate well and what parts don't. Again, ask me any questions on the differences, similarities between these two knives down in the comments. I will do my best to answer them. And yeah, hope you found this to be a good use of your time. This has been Clark the Knife, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.